The first sound Logan Pierce heard was laughter, and it wasn't his. It was sharp, careless, almost insulting in its ease, the kind of sound that didn't belong in rooms where billion-dollar negotiations were supposed to live and die in silence. He looked up from his glass of still water and saw her across the room, moving between tables like she didn't exist in the same reality as everyone else. Black uniform slightly wrinkled, hair tied back in a simple knot, face calm in a way that irritated him more than it should have. People like her shouldn't be anywhere near high-level clients, he said under his breath, not bothering to hide the contempt in his tone, even though no one had asked for his opinion. The waitress didn't react. She didn't even look in his direction. That alone bothered him more than if she had. Ava Reynolds, according to the name tag on her chest, placed a plate down with steady hands at table 12, where Hiroshi Tanaka and his delegation were seated. The atmosphere shifted immediately, subtle but undeniable. The kind of shift Logan had learned to recognize after years of closing deals that shaped entire markets. Something important was happening. He just didn't know what yet. Water? Ava asked politely, her voice soft but precise. No unnecessary warmth, no attempt to impress. One of Logan's associates scoffed quietly, leaning toward him. They really let anyone work in places like this now. Logan smirked, not taking his eyes off her. It's not about who they let in. It's about who knows where they belong. Ava placed the last glass down and finally turned, just slightly, enough for Logan to catch her profile. There was nothing remarkable about her at first glance, nothing that would suggest significance. And yet she carried herself with an unsettling stillness, like someone who had already survived things most people in that room couldn't imagine. Across the table, Hiroshi Tanaka began speaking in Japanese, his tone measured but fast, layered with technical terms that made Logan's in-house translator pause immediately. The translator frowned, hesitating, then attempted a response that didn't fully land. A second delegate leaned in, whispering corrections, but the confidence in the room was already slipping. Logan noticed it instantly. Deals didn't collapse loudly. They unraveled quietly, like threads coming loose in expensive fabric. Ava paused mid-step, just for a fraction of a second. Then she turned her head slightly toward the table, not interrupting, not intruding, just listening. Logan caught it. The smallest reaction. Recognition. "Is there a problem?" he asked sharply, more to assert control than from concern. No one answered him immediately. Hiroshi continued speaking, now slower, more deliberate, repeating a clause that made the translator visibly uncomfortable. Logan leaned forward. What did he just say? The translator hesitated again. That hesitation was enough. Ava set down her tray slowly. "He said you misunderstood the clause," she said calmly without turning around fully. Her voice cut through the noise like something far too precise to ignore. Logan narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." Ava finally turned to face the table fully. Her expression wasn't defensive. It wasn't nervous. It was simply certain. "He said the intellectual property rights are not partially shared," she continued evenly. "They are fully retained under their jurisdiction unless you agree to a restructuring fee you didn't notice in subsection B." The room went still. Logan let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "And you understand Japanese contract law now?" Ava met his gaze without blinking. Yes. It wasn't arrogance. It was fact. And somehow that made it worse. For a moment after she spoke, the entire room behaved as if sound itself had been lowered, not because anyone commanded silence, but because no one knew what to say next. Logan Pierce felt at first as a pressure behind his eyes, the kind that came when a situation stopped following the rules he had built his life on. He had built companies, crushed competitors, rewritten contracts in his favor across continents. And yet here, in a quiet restaurant filled with the soft clinking of glass and polite conversation, a waitress had just spoken with the certainty of someone who understood the entire structure of a deal that had taken his team 3 months to prepare. "That is not possible," one of his advisors said quickly, almost laughing as if to reset the atmosphere. "She is a waitress." Ava did not react to the comment. She simply adjusted the edge of her sleeve, her posture unchanged, her attention still anchored to the negotiation table where Hiroshi Tanaka now studied the documents with a calm expression that had shifted slightly, as if something had finally been acknowledged. Logan turned his head slowly toward her. "Then explain it," he said, his voice controlled but sharpened by disbelief. Ava looked at him directly. Not at the table. Not at the documents. At him. You agreed to a clause that allows full intellectual property control transfer if the first phase milestones are met within 18 months, she said evenly. But the Japanese version states 14 months. That difference is not accidental. It is leverage. The translator at the table froze, flipping through pages faster now, eyes scanning lines that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Logan felt something tighten in his chest. He had personally approved that contract structure. He had reviewed every translation summary provided by his legal team. We verified that translation twice, he said. Ava nodded once. Then you verified the wrong version. That sentence landed heavier than anything else in the room. Hiroshi Tanaka finally leaned back in his chair, observing Ava with a quiet expression that carried no surprise, only recognition. You understand Kigo-level negotiation language, he said in Japanese. His tone was no longer dismissive. It was curious, respectful. Ava responded in the same language, fluid and precise, her voice shifting slightly, not louder, not faster, just different, like someone stepping into a version of themselves she rarely revealed. Logan did not understand the words, but he understood the effect immediately. The delegation's posture changed. Subtle adjustments. Attention redirected. Authority redistributed. Logan's associate leaned in, whispering urgently, "We are losing control of this discussion." Logan did not respond. He was watching Ava now in a way that felt uncomfortably unfamiliar. Not as staff, not as background presence, as something else entirely. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, slower this time. Ava paused, just long enough for the moment to stretch. "I used to work in international compliance consulting," she said. Before this, Logan repeated, his tone tightening. "You mean before waiting tables?" Ava did not flinch. "Before I disappeared from that world." The word lingered. Disappeared. Not left. Not changed. Disappeared. Hiroshi Tanaka spoke again, gesturing lightly toward Ava now, asking a question that the translator hesitated to repeat. Ava answered without hesitation. Logan noticed something then that unsettled him more than the contract error. The room was no longer looking at him. They were looking at her. Logan Pierce realized the shift before anyone else in the room admitted it. It was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like gravity changing direction without warning. Conversations that were meant to pass through him now curved away from him and toward her. Ava Reynolds stood beside the table as if she had always belonged there, her hands resting lightly near the edge of the documents, not touching, not interfering, but clearly no longer invisible. Hiroshi Tanaka spoke again in Japanese, slower this time, his tone measured in a way that suggested he was no longer addressing a waitress, but someone he considered relevant to the outcome of the negotiation. Ava responded immediately, her voice steady, her fluency absolute, carrying the kind of precision that made every translator in the room fall silent one by one. Logan watched the exchange, his jaw tightening as he realized he was no longer the center of interpretation in his own deal. "I want a full explanation," Logan said, his voice cutting through the air, aimed at Ava but carrying to everyone. Ava turned her head slightly toward him, not startled, not defensive, simply present. "You already have it," she said. "You just were not listening to the correct version." That sentence hit harder than any accusation. One of Logan's advisors shifted uncomfortably. "This is highly irregular," he said. "She is not part of this negotiation structure." Hiroshi raised his hand slightly, stopping the advisor without even looking at him. Then he spoke directly to Ava again, and this time there was a shift in tone that Logan immediately recognized as deference. Ava replied in Japanese, and for the first time, Logan noticed something else hidden inside her fluency. She was not just translating. She was interpreting intent, meaning beneath meaning, risk beneath language. When she finished speaking, Hiroshi gave a small nod, slow and deliberate. Logan felt a cold awareness form in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time the question lost its irritation and gained weight. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the contract again, scanning a section with her eyes as if recalling something stored long before this moment. "I used to work with international acquisition teams," she said finally. "Before I chose to stop." "Chose," Logan repeated. "People do not just walk away from this level of expertise." Ava finally looked directly at him again. and this time there was something quieter behind her calm expression. Not emotion, memory. Sometimes they are not given a choice that looks like staying, she said. The room did not interrupt her. Even the air seemed to hold still for a fraction longer than normal. Hiroshi spoke again, and this time he gestured toward Ava as he spoke, asking something that shifted the attention of his entire delegation. Ava answered without hesitation, and when she finished, one of Hiroshi's team members lowered his head slightly in acknowledgement. Logan saw it clearly now. Respect. Not for him. For her. You were never just a waitress, Logan said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Ava's gaze did not change. I am what I need to be, she replied. And for the first time since the negotiation began, Logan Pierce understood that the real risk in the room was not the contract, not the deal, and not the Japanese delegation. It was the fact that he had no idea who had just stepped into his world and quietly rewritten the balance of it without asking permission. Logan Pierce could feel the negotiation slipping out of his control in real time, not because anyone had raised their voice, but because the structure he trusted no longer belonged entirely to him. Ava Reynolds stood beside the table with a calmness that felt almost disruptive, as if silence itself had started working in her favor. Hiroshi Tanaka now spoke less to Logan's legal team and more toward her, each sentence in Japanese carrying a level of technical precision that even the translators hesitated to fully interpret without her presence. Logan watched this carefully, his expression controlled, but his mind moving quickly through possibilities, recalculating every assumption he had made in the last 3 months. We need to pause this, Logan said finally, his voice firm as he gestured toward his advisors. There seems to be a translation inconsistency that needs verification. One of his senior analysts immediately nodded, grateful for the reset. Ava, however, did not move. She simply looked at Logan as if she had expected that response long before he said it. There is no inconsistency, she said quietly. There is only what was intentionally written in 2 different languages to create ambiguity in authority distribution. The room tightened again. Logan exhaled slowly through his nose. You are suggesting intentional manipulation? He asked. Ava tilted her head slightly. I am stating a structural fact. Hiroshi Tanaka spoke again, and this time his tone carried something sharper, a direct question aimed at testing not just understanding but credibility. Ava responded instantly, and as she did, Logan noticed something unsettling in the delegation's reaction. They were not surprised by her fluency. They were confirming it. One of Hiroshi's advisors leaned in and quietly said something that made another member of the delegation nod in recognition. Logan stepped slightly closer. This is not normal, he said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Ava finally turned toward him fully. No, she said. It is not normal for this room. That answer landed differently than anything before it. Logan studied her face, searching for the kind of tells he was trained to recognize in boardrooms across the world. Hesitation, performance, strategy. But what he saw instead was consistency. Ava was not reacting to pressure. She was operating within it. Where did you really learn this level of Japanese negotiation language? Logan asked again, slower now. Ava did not answer immediately. For the first time, there was a pause that felt less like avoidance and more like calculation. Then she said, in rooms very similar to this one. That answer created more questions than it solved. Logan felt it immediately. One of his advisors leaned toward him and whispered, we may need to reconsider her involvement entirely. But Hiroshi interrupted before Logan could respond, speaking directly and clearly in Japanese, his tone firm but respectful. Ava replied, and this time when she finished, Hiroshi nodded once and placed the pen down on the table, a gesture that signaled a shift in intent. Logan caught it instantly. They were waiting for her approval, not his. A quiet frustration tightened in his chest, but beneath it, something else formed. Curiosity, sharpened by uncertainty. Ava stepped slightly away from the table, as if creating space for the structure of the negotiation to settle. Logan followed her movement with his eyes. You are not just translating, he said. Ava looked back at him. No, she replied calmly. I am correcting what gets lost when people assume language is only communication. For the first time since the negotiation began, Logan Pierce realized the deal was no longer the most important thing in the room. Understanding her was. Logan Pierce no longer trusted the room in the same way he had at the beginning of the meeting. Something fundamental had shifted, and it was not written in any contract or spoken in any clause. It was written in behavior, in silence, in who people were now looking at when decisions were being made. Ava Reynolds stood slightly apart from the table, her presence no longer that of staff, but something closer to an invisible authority that no one had formally assigned, but everyone seemed to recognize. Hiroshi Tanaka continued speaking in Japanese, but his tone had softened, no longer defensive, more exploratory, as if the negotiation itself had changed shape and was now being rebuilt. Around Ava's input, Logan noticed it immediately. Every time Ava responded, the temperature of the discussion shifted. Not emotionally, structurally. His advisor leaned in again, voice low. This is becoming a liability. We are losing control of narrative direction. Logan did not respond right away. His eyes stayed on Ava. She is not a liability, he said quietly, almost as if testing the sentence. Ava turned slightly, hearing him despite the distance. Then what am I? She asked calmly, not challenging, simply asking for definition. The question lingered longer than it should have. Logan had built his entire career on defining people quickly. Competitor, partner, obstacle, asset. But none of those categories fit her anymore. You are not supposed to be here, one of the senior executives finally said, frustration slipping through professionalism. Ava nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact she had already accepted long ago. Most important conversations in the world are decided in places people are not supposed to be, she replied. Hiroshi Tanaka suddenly stood slightly, speaking again in Japanese, this time more direct, and for the first time his tone carried something like acknowledgement toward Ava personally. She answered immediately, and when she did, Logan saw Hiroshi's expression shift into something more definitive. He was agreeing to something. Without Logan, Logan felt the weight of that realization settle heavily. What did he just agree to? Logan asked sharply. The translator hesitated. Ava responded before the translator could speak, her voice steady. He agreed to adjust the structure of the partnership based on corrected interpretation of ownership timing. Logan's eyes narrowed. That was not on the table. Ava looked at him directly. It was always on the table. You just could not read it correctly. The words were not insulting in tone, but they landed with precision. Logan felt the frustration rise, not at her arrogance, but at the possibility that she might be right. One of the executives stepped forward. We need to halt this discussion and verify all translation sources immediately. Hiroshi raised his hand again, but this time he was not stopping conflict. He was waiting for Ava. That detail changed everything. Logan noticed it clearly now. The Japanese delegation was no longer negotiating through him. They were negotiating through her interpretation of intent. Ava finally stepped closer to the table, placing her hands lightly on the edge without pressure, grounding herself in the structure of the discussion. If you continue with your original interpretation, she said, looking at Logan, you will lose control of intellectual property distribution within 18 months, not through breach, but through compliance with your own misunderstanding. Logan stared at her for a long moment. The room waited. Even the air felt suspended. For the first time since the negotiation began, Logan Pierce realized he was no longer fighting another company. He was fighting the fact that someone in the room understood the truth better than he did, and he did not yet know whether that was an advantage or a collapse in progress. The silence that followed Ava Reynolds' last statement did not feel like confusion anymore. It felt like recalibration. Logan Pierce noticed it in the smallest movements first. The way his legal advisor stopped flipping pages. The way the translator lowered his pen. The way Hiroshi Tanaka no longer looked at Logan when speaking about adjustments to the agreement. Everything in the room had subtly shifted its axis, and Ava had become the reference point. Logan did not like that feeling. Not because it was incorrect, but because it was unfamiliar. Ava stood calmly, her posture unchanged, as if none of this pressure reached her. If anything, she looked more settled now than when the meeting began. We need to verify her claims independently, one of Logan's executives said, breaking the silence with forced authority. This level of correction cannot be accepted without documentation. Ava turned slightly toward him. Then you should verify the original source language, not my correction, she said. Her tone was not defensive. It was instructional. Hiroshi Tanaka raised his hand lightly again, this time speaking a short sentence in Japanese that made his entire team pause. The translator hesitated before responding, but before he could fully interpret, Ava spoke in return. Her answer was immediate, precise, and far more detailed than the translation provided. Logan saw it then. The delegation was not reacting to confidence. They were reacting to accuracy. One of Hiroshi's advisors leaned in and spoke quickly, and Hiroshi responded with a single nod. The agreement on the table was being adjusted in real time. Logan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger yet. Something more dangerous. Uncertainty. Stop, Logan said, his voice cutting through the exchange. The room turned toward him. For the first time since Ava had spoken, he felt the attention return, but it did not hold the same weight it had at the beginning. We are not proceeding with changes based on a single unverified interpreter, he said firmly. Ava looked at him. Not surprised. Not offended. Just steady. You are not proceeding based on language at all, she said. You are proceeding based on assumptions. The word landed cleanly. Assumptions. Logan had built his entire reputation on removing assumptions from business decisions. Yet here she was, pointing out the exact place where he had unknowingly built one into a multi-billion-dollar structure. One of the executives stepped forward again. This is becoming unacceptable. We need credential verification immediately. Ava nodded slightly. That is reasonable, she said. Then she added, almost as an afterthought. But it will not change what was already written. Hiroshi spoke again, slower now, and this time there was no ambiguity in his tone. He was confirming Ava's interpretation. The translator finally spoke with hesitation. He says the structure she described is correct under the original submission language. A quiet wave of tension moved across the table. Logan leaned back slightly, studying Ava in a way he had not before. You are not on our payroll, he said slowly. Ava met his gaze. No, she replied. That is why I am not incentivized to be wrong. That sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. Logan had heard every variation of negotiation language in his career, but never one that framed truth as independence. Hiroshi stood, signaling the end of the formal discussion phase. The room began to shift, papers gathering, chairs adjusting, voices lowering into post-meeting exchanges. But Logan did not move. His eyes remained on Ava. Because in a room full of billion-dollar decisions, she was the only variable he could not categorize, and that made her the most important part of the entire negotiation without ever having been invited into it. Logan Pierce remained still long after the room had begun to move again around him. Conversations resumed in fragments. Chairs shifted, papers were gathered, and assistants began speaking in lowered tones about revised clauses and follow-up confirmations, but none of it fully registered in the way it should have. His attention stayed anchored to Ava Reynolds, who now stood slightly apart from the negotiation table as if she had stepped out of the system rather than into it. Hiroshi Tanaka had already returned to his delegation, yet even from a distance, Logan could see that Ava's presence still shaped the final tone of their discussion. It was not authority in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle. It was recognition. One of Logan's executives approached him cautiously. We should proceed with damage control on the documentation discrepancy, he said. Logan did not respond immediately. His eyes stayed on Ava. There is no discrepancy anymore, Logan said finally. The executive hesitated. Sir. Logan exhaled slowly. She is correct. The structure was written in dual interpretation language. We assumed consistency where there was intentional variance. That statement changed the posture of the people around him. Not because it was dramatic, but because Logan Pierce did not admit miscalculations easily. Ava overheard it. She turned her head slightly toward him. Now you are listening, she said. It was not approval. It was observation. Logan stepped forward for the first time without consulting anyone. The distance between them closed, not physically significant, but socially irreversible. You said you used to work in international acquisition teams, he said. Ava nodded once. Correct. Why? Leave. Logan asked. Ava paused, and for the first time since the negotiation began, her expression carried something quieter beneath the surface. Not vulnerability, exactly. More like containment. Because interpretation is only valued until it becomes inconvenient, she said. Logan studied her carefully. That does not sound like a choice someone makes voluntarily. Ava's gaze did not shift. Not all exits are chosen. Some are enforced through absence of trust. That sentence landed differently than the rest. Logan had built companies on trust structures, verification systems, layered accountability. Yet none of them accounted for what she had just described. Hiroshi Tanaka approached again, this time accompanied by one of his senior advisors. He spoke briefly in Japanese, then paused. Ava responded immediately, her tone softer now, not less precise, but more measured. The advisor nodded slowly, then bowed slightly toward her. Logan saw it clearly. Respect had already been established before he even understood the language being spoken. When the Japanese delegation finally began to leave the room, Hiroshi stopped briefly beside Ava. He said something short. Ava replied in the same language. Hiroshi gave a final nod and then continued walking. Logan turned slightly. What did he say? Ava looked at him. He said this deal only succeeded because someone outside the system corrected it. Logan's expression tightened slightly. And your response? Ava adjusted her sleeve calmly. I told him the system only works when it allows correction. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Structural silence. The kind that happens when something foundational is being redefined in real time. Logan finally spoke again. You are not just fluent in language, he said. Ava met his gaze. Language is not the skill, she replied. Understanding what people avoid saying is. That was the moment Logan Pierce stopped viewing her as part of the negotiation and started understanding that she had been the negotiation itself from the beginning without anyone realizing it. The room had almost completely emptied, but Logan Pierce still had not moved. The final echoes of the Japanese delegation's departure faded down the corridor, replaced by the softer sounds of staff resetting tables and closing service for the evening. Yet for Logan, nothing in the environment felt like an ending. It felt like a transition that had not been fully defined yet. Ava Reynolds stood near the edge of the dining space, no longer surrounded by officials, translators, or executives. The absence of that structure made her presence feel even more distinct, as if she had stepped outside of the roles everyone else had been assigned. Logan finally approached her, slower than before, without the authority he usually carried into rooms like this. You were not improvising, he said. Ava looked at him. No, she replied simply. I was correcting. Logan studied her carefully. Correcting requires prior knowledge of systems most people never access. Ava's expression remained steady. Most systems are not as exclusive as they pretend to be. They are just poorly understood by the people who rely on them without questioning them. That answer did not satisfy him, but it aligned too well with what he had just experienced to dismiss it. Logan glanced toward the now empty negotiation table. My team believed we had full translation coverage, he said. They believed the risk was controlled. Ava nodded once. Control is usually an assumption created after partial verification. Logan exhaled slowly, processing that. You are saying we were operating blind. I am saying you were operating on incomplete visibility and trusting confidence to fill the gaps, she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, only structure. One of Logan's senior advisors approached cautiously, stopping a few steps away. Sir, we have secured updated legal review teams for immediate post-analysis, he said. Logan raised a hand slightly. Not necessary, he said. The advisor hesitated. We should still confirm external validation of her interpretation. Logan did not look away from Ava. It is already validated, he said. The advisor blinked. By whom? Logan paused for a fraction of a second. Then he said, by the outcome. Ava's gaze shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the logic without endorsing it. Logan stepped closer again, lowering his voice. You said you used to work in international acquisition consulting, he repeated. Ava nodded. Yes. At what level, he asked. Ava hesitated for the first time, a fraction longer than before. At the level where decisions were made before documents reached negotiation tables, she said. Logan's expression tightened. That was not entry level. That was structural advisory. Then why leave? He asked again, quieter now. Ava looked past him for a moment, toward the glass walls of the restaurant where the city lights reflected faintly in the evening dark. Because systems that depend on interpretation tend to remove people who interpret too accurately, she said. The statement was calm, but it carried weight that did not need explanation. Logan understood enough to know there was more behind it, but not enough to challenge it without assumptions. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but unresolved. Finally, Logan spoke again. You just changed the outcome of a multi-billion-dollar agreement in under 10 minutes, he said. Ava corrected him gently. No, she said. I exposed what was already written but not understood. Logan nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction. It mattered, more than it should have. For the first time in the entire evening, he realized the negotiation had never been about winning or losing. It had been about whether the truth of the structure would ever be seen clearly enough to matter. And Ava Reynolds had been the only person in the room who saw it from the beginning. The restaurant had settled into a post-event stillness, the kind of silence that follows the departure of powerful people who leave behind a different kind of air. Logan Pierce remained standing near the negotiation table, but his attention was no longer on documents or outcomes. It was fixed on Ava Reynolds, who now appeared less like a participant in a corporate process and more like a variable that had rewritten the process itself. Ava adjusted her stance slightly, as if preparing to leave without ceremony, but Logan spoke before she could turn away. You said you used to work in international acquisition. Consulting, he said again, slower this time, as if repetition might unlock a detail he had missed. Ava nodded once. Yes. Logan took a step closer. At what firm? Ava hesitated for the first time that evening. A pause so small most people would not have noticed it, but Logan had built his entire career on noticing precisely those gaps. It was not a public firm, she said finally. That answer created more silence than it resolved. Logan studied her carefully. Non-public firms do not handle cross-border intellectual property negotiations at this scale unless they are operating at government advisory level or corporate shadow structures, he said. Ava did not confirm or deny. She simply said, labels are less important than function. Logan exhaled slowly. That is not a denial. Ava looked at him directly. It is not an admission either. The exchange left Logan more unsettled than any contract revision earlier that night. One of his executives approached again, lowering his voice. Sir, the updated legal team is requesting your confirmation before we finalize the revised interpretation notes. Logan did not look at him. Pause it, he said. The executive blinked. We have already circulated preliminary adjustments. Logan's tone remained calm, but final. Then recall them. That decision alone shifted the energy of the room again. Ava noticed it immediately. You are stopping the correction process? She asked. Logan turned slightly toward her. I am stopping assumptions from becoming policy, he said. Ava regarded him for a moment, then nodded once. That is rare in your position, she said. Logan gave a short, almost imperceptible response. So is someone who can read between 3 languages of legal structure without a formal seat at the table. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the empty table where the negotiation had taken place. People think language is translation, she said finally. It is not. It is power distribution. Logan considered that carefully. And you were saying power was misallocated in this agreement. Ava corrected him gently. I am saying power was assumed to be where it was not actually written. That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. Logan stepped back slightly, breaking direct proximity for the first time. If what you are saying is accurate, he said, then this was never a negotiation in the traditional sense. Ava looked at him with quiet certainty. It was always a negotiation, she replied. It was just conducted at a level most participants did not realize existed. Logan felt something shift internally at that statement. Not discomfort exactly. Reclassification. He had spent years believing he operated at the highest tier of global negotiation structures. Yet tonight, without entering the room as an equal participant, Ava Reynolds had altered the outcome simply by recognizing what others ignored. Logan finally spoke again, his voice lower. People like you do not stay invisible for long, he said. Ava met his gaze. They stay invisible as long as systems benefit from not seeing them, she replied. And in that moment, Logan Pierce understood that the real story of the evening had never been the deal that was signed or corrected. It was the realization that someone outside his world had been reading it more accurately than he ever had. Logan Pierce remained in the restaurant long after the negotiation had officially ended, as if leaving would require him to accept that nothing about the evening could be categorized in a way that made sense anymore. Ava Reynolds stood a few feet away from him, still calm, still composed, but no longer functioning as part of any formal structure he could define. The room was nearly empty now, only a few staff members quietly resetting chairs and clearing glasses, Yet the atmosphere still carried the weight of what had just occurred. Logan finally broke the silence. "You said systems only work when they allow correction," he said. Ava looked at him. "Yes." Logan nodded slightly. "Then what happens when the system does not allow correction?" Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the table where the negotiation had taken place, as if replaying invisible layers of conversation that were not written on any document. "Then the correction happens outside the system," she said. Logan studied her for a long moment. "And you operate outside systems?" he asked. Ava's expression remained steady. "I operate where systems become blind to their own assumptions." That answer settled into Logan's thoughts more deeply than he expected. One of his executives approached again, this time more hesitant. "Sir, the legal department is requesting immediate clarification on whether we proceed with revised interpretation filing tonight or postpone until external arbitration review." Logan did not take his eyes off Ava. "Postpone," he said. The executive blinked. "That will delay finalization by at least 48 hours. Logan nodded once. "That is acceptable." Ava turned slightly toward him. "You are slowing down a billion-dollar timeline because of one conversation," she said. Logan responded without hesitation. "I am slowing it down because I do not understand it yet." That statement changed the tone between them again. Ava regarded him with something closer to evaluation now, as if recalculating his role in the situation. "Most people do not admit that," she said. Logan gave a faint nod. "Most people do not have the luxury of being wrong in front of the right information." A brief silence followed. Then Ava stepped slightly away from the table, signaling what looked like departure. Logan noticed it immediately. "Where are you going?" he asked. Ava paused. "Back to where I am not part of corporate interpretation layers." Logan frowned slightly. "That answer is too vague to be practical." Ava looked at him directly. "That is intentional." The simplicity of the response made it harder to challenge. Logan took a slow breath. "You changed the outcome of this negotiation," he said. Ava corrected him again. "No, I aligned the outcome with what was already true in the original structure." Logan nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction again. Truth versus interpretation. Structure versus assumption. For the first time, he realized this was not about language proficiency or translation skill. It was about access to clarity that others did not have. "If I wanted to understand how you saw this," Logan said carefully, "would that be possible?" Ava studied him for a moment, then answered. "It is possible," she said, "but it requires accepting that most of what you consider certainty is actually convenience." Logan did not respond immediately. That sentence landed differently than all the others. Not as challenge, as invitation into something unfamiliar. Ava adjusted her bag slightly, preparing to leave again. This time Logan did not stop her, but he also did not look away as she walked toward the exit, realizing that the most important variable in his entire professional life had just walked out of the negotiation room without ever officially being part of it. Logan Pierce stood alone for a moment after Ava Reynolds left the restaurant, his eyes still fixed on the glass doors, as if expecting her presence to somehow reverse itself and return to the room. The negotiation was officially over. The documents were being finalized by his legal team, and yet none of that felt like the conclusion of anything meaningful. It felt instead like the beginning of something he had not agreed to participate in. One of his executives approached carefully. "Sir, the revised interpretation notes are ready for your review before submission," he said. Logan did not respond immediately. His attention was still anchored to the empty space where Ava had been standing. "Hold them," he said finally. The executive hesitated. "Until when?" Logan's answer came without hesitation. "Until I understand what actually happened in this room." The executive frowned slightly, but nodded and stepped away. The restaurant continued its quiet reset around him, but Logan remained still, replaying every exchange, every correction, every moment where control had shifted without permission or warning. Ava had not argued. She had not negotiated in the traditional sense. She had simply revealed structure that already existed beneath the assumptions everyone else was using. That realization was becoming more difficult for Logan to ignore. Outside, the city lights reflected against the glass, blurred and distant, but something in that reflection reminded him of how little clarity he actually had about the systems he relied on. Then his phone vibrated. A message from his legal director appeared on the screen. confirming a temporary pause in all external filings related to the agreement. Logan stared at it for a moment, then turned the phone off entirely. For someone like him, stopping a process mid-execution was not a casual decision. It was a reset of operational identity. He finally turned away from the table and walked toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the night air felt sharper, more grounded, as if it belonged to a different version of reality than the one he had just left behind. He scanned the street briefly, not because he expected to see Ava, but because part of him was still adjusting to the idea that someone like her existed outside controlled environments. There was no sign of her, only movement of traffic, distant conversations, and the steady rhythm of a city that did not care about negotiations or corrections. Logan adjusted his coat and paused near the entrance. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to think clearly about the one thing he had been avoiding. Ava Reynolds had not simply interpreted language. She had exposed the gap between what he believed he was signing and what was actually written. And more importantly, she had done it without asking for permission, recognition, or validation. His phone vibrated again, but he ignored it. Instead, he looked back through the glass one more time at the empty table inside. Then he said quietly to himself, almost as if acknowledging a problem he could no longer delegate, "I need to find out who she really is." Logan Pierce did not leave the area immediately after stepping out of the restaurant. He remained on the sidewalk for several moments, standing in a way that suggested he was waiting for something that would not arrive. The city continued its usual rhythm around him, cars passing, distant conversations fading into the night air, but his focus remained fixed on the fact that nothing about the past hour could be categorized in any familiar operational framework. Ava Reynolds was no longer visible. No trace of where she went, no indication of direction, and yet, her presence still dominated his thinking with unusual persistence. His phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from his executive assistant confirming that internal documentation review had been placed on temporary suspension until further instruction. Logan stared at the notification for a moment, then locked the screen without responding. For someone who operated with scheduled precision, the absence of control felt more disruptive than any financial loss he had ever experienced. He finally walked toward his vehicle, but instead of entering immediately, he paused beside it, looking back toward the restaurant entrance. The glass doors reflected faint movement inside, but nothing that resembled clarity. Ava had not been part of his formal negotiation team, and yet she had influenced the final outcome more than anyone present. That contradiction stayed with him as he entered the car. Inside, the driver waited silently, expecting direction. "Corporate office," Logan said, then paused. "No," he corrected himself. "Not yet." The driver hesitated. "Sir." Logan leaned back slightly, eyes still unfocused. "Take me back to the restaurant," he said. The driver nodded and started the engine without further question. As the car pulled away from the curb and then circled back into traffic, Logan looked out the window, replaying every moment of the meeting. Ava had not tried to impress anyone. She had not positioned herself strategically. She had simply corrected what others misunderstood and left without attempting to claim authority from it. That detail was becoming increasingly difficult for him to dismiss. When the vehicle arrived again near the restaurant, Logan stepped out alone. The entrance was still open, but the interior was quieter now, nearly cleared. A staff member at the front glanced at him with mild confusion, recognizing him as part of the earlier event. "She is not here," the staff member said before Logan could ask. Logan nodded slightly. "Do you know where she went?" The staff member hesitated. "She usually leaves through the side exit. Does not stay after closing." Logan thanked him and walked toward the indicated direction. The alley behind the restaurant was empty, lit by a few dim overhead fixtures that cast soft reflections on the pavement. No sign of movement. No indication of direction beyond what had already been lost. Logan stood there for a moment, adjusting to the realization that for the first time in years, he did not have a method to retrieve information he considered necessary. Ava Reynolds was not in any system he could access, and that absence, more than anything else, confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. She had not been part of the structure he thought he was operating within. She had been operating above it. Logan Pierce remained standing outside the restaurant long after the night had fully settled into silence. The city around him continued moving, but he felt as if something inside him had paused in a way that no scheduled meeting or executive decision could resume. He had returned to the location where Ava Reynolds had last been seen, only to confirm what he already knew. She was not part of any system he could trace, retrieve, or assign meaning to through normal channels. And yet, she had changed the structure of one of his most important negotiations without ever asking for recognition. He finally exhaled slowly and looked toward the empty sidewalk where she had likely walked away hours earlier. There was no frustration in him anymore. It had shifted into something quieter, understanding without closure, the kind of realization that does not demand action, only acknowledgement. He turned away from the alley and walked back toward his vehicle. This time, he did not ask the driver to wait or reroute. Instead, he simply sat in the back seat and stared forward in silence. "Home," he said. The car moved through the city lights, but Logan's attention was no longer on the streets outside. It was on the gap she had revealed inside his thinking. A gap between assumption and structure, between language and truth, between what he believed he controlled and what had actually been guiding outcomes all along. When he arrived at his residence, Logan did not immediately enter. He stood for a moment outside the glass doors of his building, looking up at the reflected skyline. Everything around him still belonged to his world, yet something within that world had shifted permanently. Inside, his assistant approached with updated reports and notifications. He raised a hand gently to stop them. "Not tonight," he said quietly. The assistant paused, surprised but nodded and stepped back. Logan walked alone into his apartment. The space was quiet, designed for efficiency, success, and isolation, but for the first time it felt incomplete. He set his coat down and stood in the center of the room, letting the silence settle. Then he did something he had not done in years. He replayed a conversation not to find advantage, but to understand meaning. Ava Reynolds had not argued for power. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply restored accuracy where assumption had replaced it, and then left without waiting for validation. Logan sat down slowly, as if absorbing the weight of that realization physically. In his mind, the negotiation was no longer about a contract or a deal. It had become something else entirely. A reminder that intelligence without visibility still changes outcomes. That truth does not require permission to exist, and that influence is not always tied to position. Hours later, Logan remained in the same place, no longer reviewing documents, no longer analyzing outcomes, but simply accepting a perspective he had previously overlooked. For the first time, he understood that what Ava Reynolds had given him was not correction in a negotiation. It was correction in perception. And in that quiet understanding, there was no loss to recover and no victory to claim. Only clarity. And as the night settled fully over the city, Logan Pierce finally allowed himself to rest inside that clarity, carrying forward not a deal completed, but a truth he could no longer unsee. If this story stayed with you in any way, take a moment to share what part of it felt most real to you, because sometimes the quietest moments are the ones we never forget. And I would genuinely like to know what you felt when everything finally became clear.